The sound of her hand across my face was louder than the Christmas music playing behind us. "You are a disgrace to this family," Eleanor said, her voice carrying over the sudden silence of 12 people frozen mid-bite at her dining table, cranberry sauce and candlelight, and her wedding china, suddenly the backdrop to something none of them would forget. I didn't say anything. My cheek burned, my eyes filled, and I set my fork down carefully, the way you handle something when your hands aren't entirely steady, and I looked at my husband, Tom, sitting 2 seats away, staring at his plate like it had suddenly become the most interesting object in the room. He said nothing either. "Mom," his sister Cassie finally managed, "what is wrong with you?" "She knows exactly what she did," Eleanor said, chin lifted, daring anyone to contradict her. I hadn't done anything. That was the strange part, the detail nobody in that room understood yet except me, and as it turned out, one person who wasn't even at the table. I sat there in silence, holding back tears I refused to let fall in front of a woman who had just struck me in front of my husband's entire family on Christmas Day, and I let the accusation hang in the air unanswered, because I already knew something Eleanor didn't. I knew my phone, sitting face down beside my water glass, was about to ring with a call that would change everything she thought she understood about her own family. "My name is Danielle Marsh. I'm 34 years old. I live outside Richmond, Virginia, and I work as a financial compliance auditor for a regional banking group, a job that has trained me, for 9 years now, to notice discrepancies other people walk right past. Tom and I had been married for 6 years. His mother, Eleanor Whitfield, had never once, in all that time, made any real effort to like me, though she perfected a kind of performance of tolerance in public that made the dislike easy for outsiders to miss. What Eleanor had accused me of, screaming it loud enough for the whole table before her hand ever made contact, was stealing money from her. $8,000, she'd said, slamming her own phone down on the table beside her plate, a bank alert glowing on the screen. "Missing from my account, and you're the only one who had access to my information, Danielle. The only one." It wasn't true. I hadn't touched Eleanor's account, hadn't looked at her finances in the 6 years I'd known her, had in fact spent most of those 6 years carefully avoiding any financial entanglement with a woman who'd once implied, at a birthday dinner 3 years earlier, that I'd clearly married Tom for security, in front of his entire extended family, delivered with a smile so practiced it took me a full week to fully understand I'd been insulted. I didn't defend myself at that table. Not because I was guilty, and not, as I would later have to explain to almost everyone in that room, because I was weak. I stayed silent because in the 9 years I'd spent auditing financial discrepancies for a living, I had learned one thing above all else. You do not argue with an accusation in the moment it's made. You let it finish. You watch who reacts, who stays quiet, who looks a little too relieved that the attention has landed somewhere other than themselves. And in that dining room, holding my stinging cheek, watching Eleanor's triumphant, righteous expression settle over the table like she'd just delivered justice instead of a slap, I noticed something. Tom's younger brother, Ryan, 26, hadn't looked surprised, hadn't looked outraged. He'd gone very still, very quickly, his fork stopping halfway to his mouth, and when I glanced at him for just a second too long, he looked down at his plate exactly the way Tom had. 2 hours later, sitting in stunned, awkward silence in Eleanor's living room while the family pretended the last 2 hours hadn't happened, my phone rang. An unknown number, area code from Charlotte, North Carolina, a city I had no particular connection to and no reason to expect a call from on Christmas evening. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something about the moment made me answer instead. "Is this Danielle Marsh?" a woman's voice asked. Careful, professional. "I'm calling from First Piedmont Bank regarding a fraud investigation flagged on an account linked to your name." I felt every head in that room turn toward me the second I said the word fraud out loud. Eleanor's expression shifting from triumph to something sharper, something closer to alarm, and for the first time since her hand had struck my face 2 hours earlier, I understood that the story everyone in that room believed was about to fall apart in front of them. The woman on the phone identified herself as a fraud specialist named Patricia Coles and asked me to confirm my identity before she could say anything further. I stepped into the hallway, my hand shaking now for a different reason than the slap, and gave her what she needed. "We flagged unusual activity on an account under the name Eleanor Whitfield," she said. Your name came up as an authorized contact on file from an application submitted 8 months ago. I'm calling to verify whether you're aware of a joint line of credit opened under both your names. I hadn't opened anything. I told her that immediately, and something in her tone shifted, the careful, practiced calm of someone who had just heard a piece of information that mattered. That's helpful, she said, because the application listed your social security number as a co-signer, and the address on file doesn't match either of your known residences. I stood in that hallway with Eleanor's Christmas garland looped along the banister behind me, understanding, in one long cold wave, that whatever had actually happened to Eleanor's $8,000 had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with an application filed 8 months earlier using my identity without my knowledge. To understand how we got to that hallway, you need to understand 6 years of small, accumulating moments I'd let go for the sake of peace. When Tom and I got engaged, Eleanor took me to lunch alone and told me, gently smiling over her salad, Tom's always been generous to a fault with the people he loves. I just hope you understand what a responsibility that is. I took it as motherly concern at the time. I understand now it was the first of many quiet warnings that I was, in Eleanor's eyes, a threat to resources she considered hers to manage. The second incident came 2 years into our marriage, when Tom's father passed and left a modest inheritance split between Tom, Cassie, and Ryan. Eleanor insisted on holding the funds for Ryan, then 22 and freshly graduated, until he's more responsible with money. Ryan never saw that inheritance directly. It moved instead into accounts Eleanor controlled, described at family gatherings as helping him get on his feet. A phrase that always made Ryan go quiet in exactly the way he had at dinner 2 hours earlier. I'd noticed, over the years, that Eleanor treated money in this family less like something that belonged to individuals and more like something that flowed through her, filtered by her judgment of who deserved access and when. Tom never questioned it. Ryan, dependent on her goodwill for years, never pushed back. I stayed quiet because it wasn't my inheritance, wasn't my business, and every time I gently raised a concern to Tom, he'd said some version of, "That's just how Mom is. It's not worth the fight." Standing in that hallway with Patricia Cole still on the line, I finally understood exactly how expensive not fighting had become. "Ms. Marsh," Patricia said, "I need you to confirm one more thing. The account holder listed as the primary applicant, the person who submitted the paperwork, matches a name already flagged in a separate case we're reviewing. Ryan Whitfield. Does that name mean anything to you?" "He's my brother-in-law," I said, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. Patricia explained, carefully what she could. 8 months earlier, an application for a $10,000 line of credit had been submitted under Eleanor's name, listing me as an authorized co-signer using information, my social security number, my employer, even my correct salary, that I had never provided to anyone outside of secure, verified channels. The funds had been disbursed to an account that traced back not to Eleanor at all, but to Ryan. I walked back into that dining room holding my phone, and the first thing I noticed was Ryan's face. He wasn't looking at his mother. He was looking at the front door, like some part of him had already started calculating an exit. "Eleanor," I said, keeping my voice level, the same tone I use walking into an audit meeting where I already know what the numbers are about to show. "The bank just confirmed the missing money wasn't taken by me. It was borrowed, using my identity, on paperwork submitted 8 months ago." The room went silent in a different way than it had after the slap. Sharper, more uncertain. "That's not possible," Eleanor said, but her voice had lost the certainty it carried 2 hours earlier. "They're opening a fraud case," I said, and they asked me if the name Ryan Whitfield meant anything to me. Every head turned toward Ryan. He didn't say anything for a long moment, and I watched the same thing happen to his face that I imagined had been happening quietly, invisibly, for years every time Eleanor helped him get on his feet, instead of simply giving him what was already his. "I was going to pay it back," he finally said, so quietly it was almost lost under the still-playing Christmas music. Before she even noticed, Eleanor's face went through something complicated, shock, then something that looked almost like protectiveness, the same instinct that had driven her to accuse me before she'd verified a single fact. "You used her account," Tom said slowly, looking at his brother for the first time all evening, "and let Mom accuse Danielle in front of everyone." "I didn't tell him to do that," Ryan said quickly, I didn't even know she'd found the charge yet. I swear I was going to explain. You used my identity, I said, and for the first time that night, my voice didn't shake at all. Not just your mother's account. Mine. To open a line of credit I never authorized. That was the moment I noticed something I'd overlooked for 6 years. Watching Eleanor's face cycle rapidly from anger at me to something far more careful now aimed at her youngest son, this family didn't actually operate on money changing hands fairly between people who earned it. It operated on Eleanor's need to control the narrative around every dollar that moved through it. And Ryan, dependent and unquestioned for years, had learned exactly how to exploit that control without ever once being asked to account for himself. I'd spent 6 years staying quiet because Tom told me it wasn't worth the fight. I was done being quiet. I expected an apology. What I got instead was Eleanor trying to rewrite what had just happened. "This is a misunderstanding within the family," she said, straightening in her chair, already reaching for control of the story the way I now understood she always did. "Ryan made a mistake. That doesn't mean the slap wasn't deserved, Danielle. You've never respected boundaries in this house, and tonight proved it." I actually laughed, short and disbelieving. "Your son used my social security number without my knowledge, and you're still angry at me? You could have told me you two had some kind of arrangement," Eleanor said, grasping now, and I realized she meant it as an accusation, that somehow I'd colluded with Ryan, that my innocence was still, in her mind, negotiable. Tom finally spoke, but not the way I needed him to. "Mom, maybe we table this until tomorrow. It's Christmas. You watched her hit me," I said to him, quiet, direct. "And you said nothing. Now you want to table the part where your brother stole my identity too." He didn't have an answer. Cassie, to her credit, stood up from the table. "This isn't okay. Any of it. Danielle, I'm so sorry." Eleanor rounded on her. "Don't you dare take her side over your own family." "She is family," Cassie said, and something in Eleanor's face flinched at that, small but real. Over the next several days, the pressure didn't ease, it redirected. Eleanor called Tom repeatedly, framing the fraud as a private family matter that didn't need outside involvement, meaning the bank's investigation, meaning any consequence for Ryan at all. Tom relayed her requests to me gently, almost apologetically, still somehow expecting me to absorb the discomfort of being both assaulted and defrauded quietly for the sake of family peace. "She's asking if you consider not pressing anything with the bank," he said one night, not quite meeting my eyes. "Ryan's scared. He could face real charges." "He should be scared," I said. "He committed fraud. That's not a family disagreement, Tom. That's a crime. And it happened to me specifically because your family has spent years treating money like something that doesn't require anyone's permission to move around." That was when I noticed the deeper pattern, the piece I'd overlooked even after everything at the dinner table. Eleanor wasn't protecting Ryan out of blind love. She was protecting the system that let her stay in control, because a formal fraud investigation meant outside eyes on finances she had spent years quietly managing without oversight, including, I suspected, more than just this one incident. I called Patricia Coles back the next morning and asked her directly whether this looked like an isolated case. "I can't discuss details of an active investigation," she said carefully. "But I can tell you we don't usually see accounts this well organized behind a single impulsive mistake." The week after Detective Bell's call about Cassie's account, I went back to work like nothing had happened, because that's what I do. I compartmentalize. I show up. I run numbers for other people's companies while my own life sits quietly on fire in the background. My manager, Priya, noticed anyway. She'd known me for 4 years, long enough to read the particular stillness I get when something's wrong that I'm not ready to talk about. "You've triple-checked the same reconciliation twice this morning," she said, setting a coffee on my desk without asking. "That's not like you." I told her, in the shortened version I'd started giving people, identity theft, family, ongoing investigation, and she didn't say anything for a moment, just sat on the edge of my desk. "You know," she said finally, "in 11 years doing this job I've noticed something. The clients who get defrauded by strangers recover fast. Anger, some embarrassment, then they move on. The ones defrauded by family take years, because the fraud isn't just financial. It's a referendum on whether the people who were supposed to protect you actually would." I didn't fully understand how true that was until the following week, when Eleanor requested a meeting. Not an apology. She was careful to specify through Tom, just a conversation to clear the air before things go further. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity about what she thought clearing the air would actually require. We met at a coffee shop, neutral ground, Tom sitting between us like a nervous referee. Eleanor came in composed, rehearsed, the same practice calm she'd used at that birthday dinner 3 years earlier when she'd implied I'd married Tom for security. "I want you to understand," she began, "that what happened at Christmas was said in a moment of shock. A mother protects her family instinctively. You'll understand that someday if you have children." I let that land for a second before answering. "Eleanor, you didn't protect your family instinctively. You accused me publicly before checking a single fact, then spent the following weeks pressuring me to drop a legitimate fraud investigation so your son could avoid consequences he's clearly needed for years. That's not instinct. That's a pattern." Her composure cracked slightly. "You have no idea what it's like to watch your children struggle." "I have some idea now," I said, "because your struggling son used my social security number to open a line of credit, and your struggling daughter had one opened in her name too, months before mine, and neither of you noticed because you trained this family never to look too closely at where the money actually went." Tom, to his credit, didn't try to soften that. He just sat there, letting it be as uncomfortable as it needed to be. Eleanor left that meeting without an apology, but something had shifted. She stopped calling to check whether I'd reconsider cooperation with the investigation. I understood, watching her walk to her car, that she'd finally accepted the case was moving forward with or without her approval, and that realization, more than any argument, was what actually slowed the family pressure campaign down. 3 weeks later, the DA's office contacted me to confirm my willingness to provide a victim impact statement if the case proceeded to sentencing. I said yes without hesitation, and spent an evening writing it out longhand first, the way I do my best thinking, before typing a clean version. I didn't write about the slap specifically. I wrote about 6 years of small dismissals that had made the slap possible, the assumption, reinforced constantly, that my discomfort mattered less than the family's comfort with itself. Ryan's sentencing hearing happened on a gray Tuesday in April, 4 months after that Christmas dinner. I remember the drive there more clearly than almost anything else from that entire year. Tom quiet beside me, both of us holding coffee we never drank, the radio off because neither of us could stand the idea of ordinary music playing on a day like that. The courtroom felt smaller and more ordinary than I'd expected. Fluorescent lights, worn carpet, a court reporter typing quietly in the corner, Ryan sitting beside his attorney in a suit that looked borrowed, sleeves a half-inch too long. He didn't look at me while I walked to the podium to read my statement. I hadn't written about the slap specifically. I'd written about 6 years of small dismissals that had made the slap possible in the first place. The birthday dinner comment about marrying Tom for security, the way concerns I'd raised about Eleanor's handling of family money had always been met with "that's just how Mom is." The quiet expectation, reinforced constantly, and never once questioned out loud until that Christmas, that my discomfort mattered less than the family's comfort with itself. I told the court that the fraud hadn't just cost me time and stress chasing bank paperwork. It had cost me 6 years of wondering whether I'd imagined the pattern, because everyone around me had been so practiced at insisting there wasn't one. Eleanor sat 2 rows back throughout the hearing, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely diminished. Not performing composure for an audience, not managing the room the way she managed every family gathering I'd ever attended. Just quiet, and older than I'd ever seen her look. The judge's questions to Ryan before sentencing were pointed in a way that surprised me. "You had access to significant family support throughout your adult life. Why identity theft, specifically, rather than simply asking for help?" Ryan's answer stayed with me longer than almost anything else that happened that year. His voice was flat, stripped of the deflection I'd watched him use at that dinner table months earlier. Because asking meant admitting I needed it, and in my family, admitting that always came with conditions. It felt easier to just take what I needed quietly and figure out the rest later. I know how that sounds. I'm not saying it was right. I thought, sitting in that gallery, about Eleanor's language over the years, helping him get on his feet. Money that moved through her control instead of directly into Ryan's hands. An inheritance he'd never fully seen because she decided, unilaterally, that he wasn't ready for it. Hearing Ryan describe the actual mechanism of his own decision-making in a courtroom, under oath, made something click into place that I hadn't fully articulated even to myself. The dysfunction I'd married into hadn't created a thief out of nowhere. It had created a young man who'd learned, from close observation of his own mother, that money in this family was never simply given. It was managed, monitored, and dispensed as leverage, dressed up as care. Eventually, predictably, someone raised inside that system decided to stop asking permission and simply take what he believed. On some level, he was owed anyway. The judge sentenced Ryan to 5 years of probation, mandatory financial counseling, 100 hours of community service, and full court-ordered restitution to both me and Cassie, to be paid in monthly installments over 18 months, processed directly through the court rather than through any family channel. That detail mattered more to me than I expected it to. It meant I never had to send a single reminder, never had to have an awkward conversation about a late payment, never had to feel, even once, like I owed anyone gratitude for being repaid money that had been stolen from me in the first place. The system handled it, cleanly, the way it should have been handled from the start. The restitution schedule held exactly as ordered. 18 months later, both Cassie and I received our final payments within the same week, and I remember sitting at my kitchen table with the confirmation email open on my laptop, feeling something settle in my chest that I hadn't realized was still unsettled. A low, persistent hum of unfinished business, finally quiet. Cassie's mandatory counseling appointment with Ryan's probation officer, which she attended as part of the victim notification process, apparently included a moment where Ryan asked, directly, whether she'd ever be willing to talk again outside of forced family gatherings. She told me about it over coffee a few weeks later, still visibly working through how she felt about the offer. "I don't know yet," she said. "I believe he's sorry. I'm just not sure sorry is the same thing as different." I understood that distinction better than most people could have by then. Cassie and I grew closer through that year in a way neither of us expected when we'd first met as future sisters-in-law, making polite conversation at engagement dinners years earlier. She started coming to our house for holidays instead of Eleanor's, initially out of necessity while she was still working through her own anger toward her mother, and eventually just out of genuine preference, because our house had become, without either of us planning it, a place where nobody had to perform anything. She told me once, almost a year after the investigation formally closed, that watching me refuse to collapse at that dinner table, not fighting back loudly, just refusing to accept an accusation as truth simply because Eleanor delivered it with enough confidence, had given her permission to finally examine things about her own upbringing she'd spent years carefully not looking at too closely. The favoritism, the money that always seemed to flow one direction, the unspoken rule that questioning Eleanor's decisions was itself the offense, regardless of what the decision actually was. Tom's relationship with his mother settled into something quieter and more distant than it had been before that Christmas, not fully estranged, but no longer automatic in the way it once was. For the first year, he visited her alone, usually for an hour, sometimes less, always debriefing with me afterward about what had and hadn't been said. Eleanor never brought up the slap directly again after that stilted Easter apology, and Tom stopped expecting her to. What changed, more meaningfully, was that Tom started noticing and naming smaller instances of the same pattern when they surfaced. A comment about my job being just numbers, a passive suggestion that we should be more available for family events on her schedule rather than ours. He'd catch it now, sometimes before I even had to point it out, and say something in the moment instead of waiting until we were home to quietly agree it had been inappropriate. That shift, more than any apology Eleanor could have offered, was what actually repaired something in our marriage. I'd spent 6 years wondering whether Tom would ever choose to see his mother's behavior clearly while it was happening, rather than explaining it away afterward. Watching him finally do that, consistently, in small unglamorous moments rather than one dramatic gesture, told me more about where we actually stood than any grand reconciliation scene could have. I've seen Eleanor exactly twice since that Easter apology. Once at Cassie's engagement party the following spring, where Eleanor was careful, quiet, clearly aware that the family's tolerance for her old patterns had permanently thinned, and that any misstep in that room would be noticed by more people than just me. She complimented my dress, briefly, awkwardly, and I accepted it the way you accept small, imperfect gestures from someone you've stopped needing anything larger from. The second time was at a hospital visit, when she had a minor cardiac procedure the following winter. I brought flowers because Tom asked me to, and because some part of me had made a quiet, deliberate peace with the idea that not forgiving someone completely and refusing them basic human decency aren't actually the same thing. I sat in that hospital waiting room for 20 minutes, said very little, and left without feeling like I'd compromised anything I'd fought to establish. I think about that Christmas dinner sometimes, not with the sharp, immediate pain it used to carry, but with something closer to clarity, the way you eventually look back at an old scar and remember the injury without flinching at the memory of it. The version of me sitting at that table 4 years ago, holding my stinging cheek in silence, watching 12 stunned faces avoid my eyes, didn't know yet that patience and documentation would be the thing that actually saved her, not confrontation in the moment, not raising my voice to match Eleanor's, not demanding immediate accountability from people who had spent years perfecting the art of avoiding it. I've learned since then that the loudest response isn't always the strongest one. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do, in the exact moment someone tries to humiliate you in front of everyone you love, is stay quiet just long enough to gather the proof that eventually makes the truth impossible for anyone in the room to argue with. The folder I kept, the police report, Patricia's fraud determination letter, Ryan's restitution schedule, that one printed photograph of my own reflection taken the night of the dinner, red mark still faintly visible on my cheek, still sits in the bottom drawer of my home office. I don't open it often anymore. Most months, I forget it's even there. But I know exactly where it is. The way you always know where you've kept the thing that proved you were right when an entire room full of people you loved was certain, for a little while, that you weren't. If someone struck you down in front of everyone you loved, accusing you of something you never did, how long would you stay silent? And what would it actually take for the truth to finally speak louder than the slap? Tell me what you would have done in the comments.